Hello, everybody. The last time we met, we were wrapping up the American Revolution and we finished off with the Treaty of 1783. We had won the victory, we had separated ourselves from the mother country, but now it was a question of be careful what you ask for, you might just get it. And so now all the questions come up of what are we going to have now? How are we going to rule ourselves? We've always had this other entity over the top of us, and now we have to come up with something of our own. And so they're going to set about determining what's equality, who's going to have the power, how are we going to set up this government. In America, we had always rejected this idea of a hereditary aristocracy, which is a good thing. You don't really want the power to be handed down from one generation to the next because you don't always know what you're going to get. So in America, freedom is going to be linked with equality and the right to vote. As states start to write their own new state constitutions, all are going to agree that the government should be a republic. A republic is where you have individuals that represent you in government. And so, who's going to have the right to vote? Do they have to be property owners? Do they have to be church members? What kind of financial risk is at stake? And so all these different questions come up. They also talk about the role that religion is going to play in the country now. In England, they had the Church of England, and it had pretty much had a tight stranglehold on the government as well as the people. And so they wanted more of a separation of church and state in setting up the new government. But that doesn't mean that they didn't believe that religion shouldn't play a big part in how we are as a society. It was necessary as a moral center. And so they're going to make sure that religion is intertwined, but it's not going to be the overarching. So you're going to find that there's going to be more freedom of worship. Catholics are going to be allowed to worship freely for the first time. But churches are going to lose some of their public funding. They're going to lose a lot of their legal privileges in this attempt to separate church and state. Where religion is really going to show up is in what's known as Christian republicanism. And this is where religious values and personal virtue are going to work together to help fend off corruption. Virtue is the ability to sacrifice self-interest for the public good. And so mothers are going to be charged with making sure that their children are raised up in this idea of civic virtue. This is known as Republican motherhood. And so the mom's job is going to teach her children how to be good citizens and therefore be able to contribute back to the community. Another aspect of the United States life now is economic standing. Freedom meant equal opportunity, not exactly equal standing. So this idea that everybody has the same chance to be successful has been a long-standing idea in the United States. Land and resources meant freedom. If you did not have those things, then you were dependent on someone else. And so the more land you had, the more freedom you had. Adam Smith, who wrote The Wealth of Nations, was the one who advocated for a free market and that it was more efficient and fair than a command market was. So capitalism and free enterprise were always the economy of the United States. Another question was, what were we going to do about the Loyalists? You have all these people here that defended Great Britain that now are living among us. A lot of them are going to be banished. About 60,000 are going to get banished either back to England or off to the west. A lot of them are going to be harassed and almost mercilessly, even though the United States in the Treaty of Paris of 1783 had promised to leave the Loyalists alone, there's still going to be this pestering of the Loyalists until they finally pack up and move on. Native Americans are going to lose land and therefore they're going to lose power. This will be the long-standing practice of the Americans to take what is not theirs and move the Indians right on over. Um, and then you also have the contradiction of slavery. How are we going to work this one out? We believe in equality, we believe in freedom, but we're going to enslave all of these people and make them work for us. And that is going to be a conundrum that is going to haunt America for the next 100 years. The debate starts with the Second Continental Congress and what's going to be included in the Declaration of Independence. The South just about walks out and threatened to refuse to sign the Declaration of Independence based off a small clause about getting rid of slavery. They don't mess with it for the longest because at this stage the country is too fragile to have a civil war split them apart. And so the founding fathers are going to brush that issue to the side until a later time. Now, there will be free blacks. Not all blacks in the United States are going to be slaves. Some of them have come over free. And they will marry and they will have children. So natural reproduction will increase the free black population. You've also got the gradual emancipation that will happen by the states as time goes by, especially in the northern states where they don't need slavery, and so they will pass laws that will emancipate the slaves in the north. And then you have something called manumission, and that is where slaves will gain their freedom by fighting in a war. So a lot will gain their freedom from fighting in the Revolutionary War on both sides. But they will also gain their freedom in their master's wills as time goes by. And then there is the question of the women. What kind of equality are they going to have? Well, there was something called coverture, which meant that once you got married, your husband had total legal authority. It was that thing of what's yours is mine and what's mine is mine. And so when a woman got married, everything she owned now became the property of her husband. And they felt that, well, if he could vote, he's just going to vote the same way she's going to vote. And so the women were not considered as a voting entity at this time, even though John Adams' wife, Abigail Adams, sent him a letter specifically telling him to remember the ladies. So as the founding fathers are putting all their ducks in a row and trying to come up with the first Constitution, all of these different things are going to be debated back and forth. Now, the first written Constitution for the United States is the Articles of Confederation of 1783. We are rather unique at the time of having a written Constitution. Whether it's the Articles of Confederation or later the U.S. Constitution, it was a document that was written down. I don't believe to this day that Great Britain has any kind of written down Constitution that lines everything out. I'm not quite sure how they keep up with all of that because they've been around for centuries. But we start off with a written document, and the first one's called the Articles of Confederation, sometimes known as the AOC. Now, the Articles of Confederation were devised to make sure that the central government had less power than the state governments. And that was because they had just gotten out of being under the King of England. And yes, there was Parliament, but the King had more power. And they didn't want that kind of central power to be so controlling. And so the Articles of Confederation were set up so that you have a weak central government. But that doesn't mean that it doesn't have its strengths. And as you've looked at in your notes, I'm sure, you've seen where I have listed both the strengths and the weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. So the Northwest Ordinances, the land ordinances of the Northwest Territory, were one of the big things that come out of the Articles of Confederation. Now, at this time, you have to remember where the Northwest Territory is. I am going to change my screen here so you can see this next map. In fact, I'm going to switch to this one here first. Here is the Northwest Territory right here. So it's this area up here around the Great Lakes. And so you have to be careful at certain times when you're thinking about the United States and what time period we're in. If we're talking about right after the Revolution, the Northwest Territory is here, because a lot of people will think Northwest Territory and they think Washington State and Oregon State, and we haven't gotten that far yet. We don't even get close to that territory until later on to the 1800s. And so the Northwest ordinances are going to settle how this area over here, how they become states. They're going to lay it out in this kind of a grid like you see down here, and they're even going to have a block set aside for public education that is funded by local taxes. The very first state to pass a public education law was Massachusetts in the 1600s, and they're going to pass what's known as the Old Deluder-Satan Act. And this was a public school law that they believed that if children were taught how to read and write, they could read the Bible and therefore escape the delusions of Satan that would lead them down the path of destruction. And so they're going to determine that every town needs to have a section set aside for a public school. It's also going to determine that you need to have 60,000 residents in your territory before you can apply for statehood. And so that's one of the good things that come out of the Articles of Confederation. Now, I must tell you, though, that the Northwest Territory Ordinances does not protect against land speculation. Land speculators are people that will go out and they'll grab up land and they'll sell it to others saying, oh, this is going to be a great buy. You need to get in on the ground level. And then it doesn't turn out to be quite as good. So it doesn't protect against those kinds of land scams that happen. Now, another thing that's going to happen with the Northwest with the Articles of Confederation is it's going to settle this territory that these Western land claims. Because as these states over here, especially these down here, find out that we have everything over here to the Mississippi River, they're going to want to claim all that. Well, that's not really good for the country as a whole. And so they're going to convince them that they need to give up this area over here so we can make it into territories and then turn it into other kinds of states. And so those are some of the successes of the Articles of Confederation. But on the other hand, you have several weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Number one, it only had one branch of government. And so you only had the legislative branch. And I know you may have heard that people claim that there was a president before George Washington. There could not have been. There might have been a president of a convention, a president of a committee, but there could not have been a president of the United States because we did not have that office established yet. We only had a Congress. The Congress could not tax. Each state only had one vote. And then to get anything to pass, it had to be unanimous. Now think about this. Think about you and your friends. How many times do y'all just in your small group can convince everybody to unanimously agree to do something? It's very rare that ever happens. And you take these states that all have their own special interests that are thousands of miles apart, and they're coming together and they have to have a unanimous vote to get something to pass. Very little got done. So they had a hard time getting the states to comply with anything. They couldn't regulate trade, so they couldn't bring in money off of tariffs. So they couldn't tax. They couldn't bring in tariffs. So there was no way for the federal government, the national government, to create a revenue base. That meant that they couldn't pay a military. And they could not provide a standard monetary system. So each state had their own money. So if you lived in Georgia and you wanted to go to South Carolina, then you had to take your Georgia money and exchange it for South Carolina money when you got over there, and go and vice versa when you went back. Now, I don't know if you've ever been out of the country, but I know that if you go from the United States into Mexico, you have to convert your American dollars into pesos. Now, for Americans, that's a really good deal because you can get 18 or 19 pesos for $1 American dollar. But if you go to some place like Bahrain over in the Middle East, it's a different thing. It takes 3 American dollars to buy 1 Bahrainian dollar. And so the monetary exchange makes things very difficult. And so you have this government that is incapable of really getting a whole lot done, and so they're being looked at by other countries as too weak to even mess with. We can't get loans, we're being laughed at, and it's going to bubble up into Shays' Rebellion. Now, you need to make sure that you keep your rebellions sorted. You have got Bacon's Rebellion that happens in the early 1600s, early 1700s, between the Western freedmen, the Western former indentured servants, who are not getting protection from the Virginia governor. That's Bacon's Rebellion. You have now Shays' Rebellion, which is Massachusetts farmers who are being taxed to where they can be taxed no more. And so they're rising up in protest against the Massachusetts State House because they're thinking, we have just fought this war to get rid of all these taxes, and now you're taxing us out the ears. And the Massachusetts government's coming back, well, I'm sorry, you elected us. You now have representation. We can tax you all we want. And so this rebellion gets so carried out of hand that they almost burned down the State House. And so Massachusetts calls for help from the federal government, and the federal government comes back and goes, sorry, we can't do anything to help you. We can't raise the military because we can't pay them. And so it really shows up how weak this particular form of government is. So out of Shays' Rebellion, you're going to have this call for the Annapolis Convention. Now, Annapolis is in Maryland, and you're going to have 5 states show up. Not very many. And so all they're going to accomplish out of the Annapolis Convention is to set up the next convention, which is going to be in Philadelphia in about 6 months. So in review, you have these basic failures of the Articles of Confederation. It's going to fail to address economic failures and issues. It's going to fail to adequately confront threats on the western border. It's going to be unable to deal with fiscal instability. And some states are going to have an unfair advantage, usually your larger states over your smaller states. And so as the group gets back together in Philadelphia to talk about how they're going to fix the Articles of Confederation, it becomes rather clear that there's really no way to fix this. And so they're just going to toss it. And they're going to come out with what becomes the U.S. Constitution. Now, there are certain fundamental things that are the basic principles of the U.S. Constitution. And right here, I have got this layout of the details of these principles. Now, let me give it to you in short fashion instead of all this long writing. Popular sovereignty means that the people have the power, that the people can vote to change or to get what they need. Okay, so I cannot stress how important it is to be a voter. When you turn 18, please register to vote, and please learn the issues, learn the candidates, and vote, because that's where your power is. Limited government means that the government only has as much power as the people give it. Now, unfortunately, since about the 1930s, we have been steadily giving the government more and more power. And I don't care if it's a government or a person or a smaller group, anything that's got a lot of power is never going to say, I'm tired of all this power now, you have some. And so you have to kind of be careful how much power you give someone, because you always have to jerk it back. They also have separation of powers. That means that they don't want to put everything in one basket. You're going to have a legislative branch, so that's going to be Congress, and they're going to be the ones that are going to make the laws. And you have an executive branch, and that's going to be like your president and vice president and cabinet, and they're going to be the ones that are charged with enforcing the laws. And then you have the judicial branch, and it's their job to interpret the laws. And so you have 3 branches of government. But you also need checks and balances. So the third one and the fourth one go together. With checks and balances, each branch of the government has the ability to check the power of the other 2 branches to keep everything in balance. So say that Congress passes a law that the president doesn't like, then he can veto it. And say that Congress though really wants that law, well, they can override the veto. Okay. Say both of them agree and they pass this law, but then the Supreme Court gets to looking at it and they think, or they see where it doesn't match up with what it says the Constitution says the government can do. They can say it's unconstitutional. So that's how the three different branches can control the power of the other two. Now, judicial review is that power of the Supreme Court to be able to review legislation to determine whether or not it's constitutional or not. It comes out of the Marbury v. Madison case that happens in the early 1800s, and it's where they established the power of the Supreme Court to be able to look at laws and make sure that they match up with what the Constitution says the government can or cannot do. And then the last one is federalism. Federalism is one that's rather sometimes hard to get your head around. It is that separation of power between the national power and the state power. So anytime that there is something going on in the country, and it's happening in this state over here and that state over there, and you're wondering why the president doesn't send somebody in and stop all that nonsense, well, that's because the president can't. The president cannot just gather up all the forces and go charging into a state. They have to be invited in. About several years ago, there was a devastating hurricane that hit Louisiana. And the federal government had tried for several days to get into Louisiana and set up rescue operations to be ready after the hurricane passed. But the governor refused until the last minute to allow the federal government to come in. And so that's an example of where federalism is an example of, where the federal government has certain powers, the state government has certain powers, and the federal government can't just come run roughshod into any state and do whatever it wants to. So those are the 6 principles of the Constitution. Now, first off, you have got to remember that the Constitution is built on a series of compromises. And some of these compromises had to do with how the people were going to be represented in Congress. And so the first one is known as the Great Compromise. It was, you had 2 different groups. You had the Virginia plan and you had the New Jersey plan. So you had the large state plan and the small state plan. Large state plan, they felt like representation should be based off of population numbers. So many representatives based off of how big your population was. Well, the small states are going, oh, no, let's not do that. That's not fair, because that gives you more representation than us. We need to have equal representation from every state. And so that's where we get what's known as a bicameral legislature. We have 2 houses. And if you look down on the top of the Capitol building, it looks like a camera with the center rotunda, and then you have the 2 wings off to the side. And so we have one body of Congress that is the Senate, and it's based off of 2 people per state. So right now we have 100 senators in the United States Senate. And then you have the House of Representatives, and it's based off of the population. So yes, the bigger states and the more populous states have got more representatives than the smaller states. And so that's called the Great Compromise, where they got both sides to come together. The other big compromise is known as the 3/5 compromise. And the North was upset that the South might get a larger number of representatives in Congress because they had such a large number of slaves in the South. And so the North comes up with the idea that it would take 5 slaves to produce the outcome of 3 paid workers. Because if you're a slave, you're not going to work that hard. You're only going to work as hard as you can get away with, so that you don't get hurt. But you don't get paid any extra. You don't get any bonus points for doing more. So they say it would take 5 slaves to do the same production as 3 paid workers who get paid more for the harder they work. I hope that makes sense. So that's where they come up with the 3/5 compromise. So for every 5 slaves, 3 get counted towards the population total as far as representation in Congress. The father of the Constitution is James Madison, and that is, here's a picture of him right there. And we'll talk more about James Madison here when we get into his presidency. He was rather a small man, and he was a very, very quiet man. But he was a great thinker. And so he is probably the most brilliant political mind post-revolution. And so part of his ideas was the idea of this federal system. And so I want to go here and show you, kind of break this down for you about the federalism and what the federal government, their powers, the state powers, and then the kind of powers that they have on both sides. And so on the national side, the national government can make treaties. They can establish and regulate the post office. They're the ones that regulate not only foreign trade, but interstate trade. So that's trade like between Texas and Arkansas, or Texas and Oklahoma. So that's interstate trade. They can tax imports and exports. They can declare war, maintain a military. They can make money. They're where you go to get your copyrights and your patents for inventions or things that you write. And then they can make all laws necessary and proper to meet the responsibilities per the U.S. Constitution. So the necessary and proper clause is where we get implied powers. So you might want to jot that down, implied powers. I will be coming back to that when we start talking about Alexander Hamilton and how he sets up the first Bank of the United States. On the state side, they can establish local governments like, governor and lieutenant governor and sheriffs and mayors and all that kind of stuff. They can regulate intrastate trade. That's trade like between Dallas and Houston. So intrastate. It's the state's job to establish public schools. So that's why you have got different laws in Texas for graduation than you have in Oklahoma or than you have in Louisiana. So like I know in Texas, the EOC test are for all 4 core subjects at one point or another. In other states, all they have to take are reading and writing and math tests. So it just depends on what state you're in. It's the state's job to conduct elections, to provide for the common good, like protecting health and safety. A friend of mine used to work for the Department of Health and Human Resources, which is a state department that helps people with special needs and stuff like that. They do regulations for marriage and professional licenses. So like I have a license to teach in the state of Texas. If I were to go to Oklahoma, I'd have to get a different license. My daughter-in-law is a dental hygienist in South Carolina. When they moved to Texas, she decided not to get her license here because she would probably had to gone all the way back through half her schooling to get a license in the state of Texas to be a dental hygienist, because the two states require different things. And then the last thing, all powers not delegated to the national government are denied to the states per the U.S. Constitution. This is basically the 10th Amendment. And so this is the states' rights clause that comes along. Now the things that both entities have are going to be that both can collect taxes. Now you're lucky you live in Texas. Texas does not have a state income tax like several states around us do. Texas collects taxes through property taxes and through sales tax. They can regulate banks, establish and administer a judiciary. I don't know if you know this or not, but there is a state Supreme Court as well as a national Supreme Court. Borrow money, provide for the common good, and make and enforce laws. So there are federal laws and there are state laws, and it just depends on what infraction or what you're looking at as to who steps in to take charge. At one time, you could get a speeding ticket in Florida, and you lived in Texas and come back to Texas and could get away with not paying it because there was no way for Florida to find out where you were. You can't do that anymore because of the computer. But each state has its different laws, so that's why you see speed limits change when you cross state lines and stuff like that. So they come up with this Constitution, and the outline of it is set up with 7 articles. And you have how it lays out what the job responsibilities are for all the different branches, and then how you go about ratifying it. So Article 1 is all about the legislative branch. So this is how Congress gets elected. This is what their powers are. This is all the different things that come with being in either the Senate or in the House of Representatives. I also made note in your notes to make sure you know about Section 8.18, because that is the necessary and proper clause that I talked about just a second ago. Article 2 is the executive branch. That's going to be your president, your vice president, the cabinet, and then the bureaucracy. All of those agencies like the FBI, the CIA, the IRS, Homeland Security, all that falls under the executive branch of the government. And then you have the judicial branch, and that's going to be your Supreme Court. Okay? And then Article 4 is about how the relation between the states. Article 5 is how do you add amendments. The nice thing about our Constitution is that it is very, very flexible. And so you can add amendments. There has even been a case of taking an amendment out. That doesn't happen very often, only happened once, but that gives elasticity to our Constitution. Article 6 is national supremacy. That means that if the national government makes a law, a state government cannot come back and make a law contradictory to that. That's where you're getting some of this debate that goes on right now, where you have a national law that says that marijuana is illegal, and you have states that have passed state laws that say it's okay. So you have this question going back and forth, and I'm not really quite sure where that stands right now. I don't know that exactly settled that out. And then, of course, Article 7 is about how to ratify the Constitution. Now, there was a lot of question about what, are we going to ratify this thing? Who likes it? Who doesn't like it? And so you're going to have these two groups emerge. One are the Federalists and one are the Anti-Federalists. And if you have seen the musical Hamilton, you know that there are the Federalist Papers that James Madison, Alexander Hamilton, and John Jay are going to write in defense of a strong central government. Okay, your Federalist leaders, of course, Alexander Hamilton, George Washington, John Adams, Ben Franklin, John Jay, and at first James Madison. Now, keep in mind, James Madison is a Virginian. He is friends with Thomas Jefferson, and Thomas Jefferson is going to be an anti-federalist. So, Federalists believe in a strong central government, and that was the best way to protect minority rights. They also believe in a loose interpretation of the Constitution. And so you might want to underline this in your notes. If it doesn't say you can't, then you can. So, it's kind of like that. Well, let me go into the next one, and then I'll give you an analogy on that. On your anti-federalist, you've got Thomas Jefferson, George Mason, Patrick Henry, and later on James Madison, and they believe in strong state governments because that's the best way to protect from a tyranny. And so they believe in a strict interpretation of the Constitution. If it doesn't say you can, then you can't. So let me give you this analogy. I tried to a second ago. Think about the dress code that you have at your school. And you have that teacher that anytime you are the least bit out of dress code, they're going to send you to the office. Okay? They have a strict interpretation of the dress code. There's nothing in that dress code that says that they can tell you to get into compliance. It says, if they're out of dress code, do this. Okay? Then you have that other teacher that will tell you to pull your pants up, take your hat off, get your ID on, whatever it is that you're out of compliance with, and give you that leeway to get into compliance. Well, there's nothing in the dress code that says they can't do that, so they have a loose interpretation of the dress code. Hopefully that's giving you a good analogy of the differences between a strict interpretation and a loose interpretation of the Constitution. Now, this is all based off of republicanism. And that's that form of government where you elect representatives to speak for you in government, and the expectation is that these representatives are going to do whatever is good for the people as a whole and not just for the elite. Hope that makes sense. Now, you're going to have this argument go back and forth over the Constitution and whether or not they're going to ratify it. and it's kind of shaky there for a while. And you have the anti-federalists that are really, really pushing for a Bill of Rights. They believe that the articles by themselves do not adequately protect individual rights. And so they finally get a promise from the other side that they will add a Bill of Rights if they'll just go ahead and ratify the Constitution. And so, oh, and I wanted to show you this picture here. This is our favorite Alexander Hamilton because of the musical. I'll have more to say about him when we get into chapter 8. But you finally have enough states that are going to ratify the Constitution that it's finally going to pass. You had to have 9 states out of the 13. You're going to have 4 laggard states that are going to wait. Rhode Island and North Carolina almost totally refused, and they finally realized that they can't, because they can't exist out of the rest of the group. And so once the promise of a Bill of Rights gets made, then the other 4 laggard states are going to sign on. So here are your Bill of Rights. Now, I know you probably know what most of these are, but sometimes they get kind of confusing. So it's the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And you have got the First Amendment, and it's got 5 pieces to it. So it's your freedom of speech, freedom of the press, freedom of religion, freedom of grievances, and the freedom of assembly. Okay? And you have to go back and look at these because it's the freedom of peaceful assembly. Okay? It's your right to free speech, but you have to understand that these are your protections from the government, not your protections from your boss, say. So say you get on Facebook and you just rake your boss over the coals out there in the press or on Facebook or what have you, yeah, they're going to fire you. And you can say First Amendment rights. Well, I'm sorry, that's only your protections from the government, not from your boss. Freedom of religion, if you go back and actually read the amendment, this states that the government cannot dictate a national religion. It's also freedom from religion. You don't have to have a religion at all. But it doesn't mean that a public figure cannot talk about what they believe. They just can't coerce you to believe the same thing. And that's what that means. The Second Amendment is your right to keep and bear arms, so your right to own a weapon. And that was the people's protection from a tyrannical government. The Third Amendment is your right to refuse soldiers living in your home. Now, I've had 2 living in mine, but those are my sons. Of course, that's okay. But because of the Quartering Act by the British, they felt at that time that it was important to have the Third Amendment. Do we really need the Third Amendment anymore? I don't really think so, but it's been there since, for 250 years. I think it's going to stay. The Fourth Amendment is the one about search and seizure. They cannot break into your house without a warrant and search for things and arrest you. They have to have a warrant. But now, there are also some qualifications about that. So I know that students sometimes are asked to leave all their things in a classroom and step out in the hall, and the authorities will come in and go through all the belongings in the room. That has to do with the fact that the schools and the administration of schools are charged with protecting everybody. And if they have heard tell that somewhere on campus there is something that's not safe, whether it is drugs or a gun or some kind of weapon, then they have the authority to be able to search for that to protect everybody else. So that's where that difference comes in. The Fifth Amendment also has several parts. You have the right to due process. That means that they have to tell you what you've been accused of. They have to give you a right to defend yourself before they take away life, liberty, or property. You also, that's where double jeopardy comes in. You cannot be tried twice for the same crime. O.J. Simpson, no matter what kind of book he writes about how he would have killed his wife had he done it, they cannot try him twice for that crime. The right to remain silent. So you have the right to refuse to testify. That's called pleading the fifth, for either yourself or for your spouse. Uh, and then the last part of that is eminent domain, where the government has the right to basically force you to sell your property at fair market value. They're going to pay you for it if it's going to be for the general good. So for roads and hospitals and stuff like that. The Sixth Amendment is all about criminal proceedings, so your right to a speedy trial, a trial by a jury of your peers. That all falls under the Sixth Amendment. The Seventh Amendment, the easiest thing is think of Judge Judy. These are civil trials where people are suing each other for one thing or another. The Eighth Amendment is your right to not be punished for different than the crime you committed, so cruel and unusual punishment. So they cannot arrest you for shoplifting and sentence you to death for shoplifting. They also cannot, even if you've done a heinous crime, they cannot cruelly punish you for that, like by drawn quartering or hanging you or chopping your head off or stuff like that. The Ninth Amendment is the one that's really, really hard to get your head around because it's non-enumerated rights. These are rights that you have that aren't exactly listed out. Probably the most easy one to tell you how it works is your right to privacy. Nowhere in the Constitution does it list out that you have a right to privacy, but they have established that you do. And that's what the Roe v. Wade court case was established on in the 1970s. So right to privacy is probably the most obvious one to tell you that falls under the Ninth Amendment. And then the 10th Amendment is states' rights and state sovereignty, which was based off of the teachings of Montesquieu. And this is where the states have sovereignty where the national government just can't come barging in. And so this is how your government is established in 1787. The Bill of Rights is added in 1791. Your Bill of Rights is based off your English Bill of Rights and the Magna Carta, things that the Englishmen had known for centuries, and so they wanted a continuation of that. Of course, the biggest contradiction is going to be slavery. Once again, they don't want to debate it because they don't think it can make everything else collapse. What they will do is outlaw the slave trade starting in 1807. That means that after 1807, they could not import slaves any longer from outside the country into the country. Another interesting thing, you have two states that have state constitutions that meet the criteria. Everybody else has to create new state constitutions with this new national constitution. Your biggest influences are going to be George Washington and Benjamin Franklin, Madison, and Hamilton. You'll notice that John Adams and Thomas Jefferson are not included in this because they're out of the country. Thomas Jefferson is in France, and John Adams is in Holland trying to get loans from the Dutch. The Dutch at the time were known as the Dutch masters. They were very, very wealthy, and he was trying to get American loans from the Dutch, and so neither one of them were in the country at the time. Another note that I've made for you in your printed notes is to remember that the nationalists are also known as the Federalists. So the two names, so interchange. So if I'm talking about the national government or the federal government, I'm talking about the same place. All right. And at this time, the capital is in New York City. It won't move to Washington, D.C. until we get to the presidency of John Adams. And so that wraps up chapters 6 and 7. Next time, we'll talk about the first two presidents, George Washington and John Adams, and some of your favorite figures like Thomas Jefferson and Alexander Hamilton. So till next time, y'all have a good one.